now let's go towards the diagnostics end of Convergence. I'm delighted to welcome Tom Metcalfe. Tom works for Roche in their Personalised Healthcare Centre of Excellence. Tom, Convergence on your terms.
Thank you. It'll be actually a diagnostics and pharmaceuticals perspective, and really thinking about perspective. But I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. And a lot of what I'm going to say is going to be very complementary to what Paul has told you about innovation in the genomic space. And I'm going to focus more on how digital technologies and digital health is impacting this undertaking. Roche has been a very keen and active participant in the Genomics England 100,000 Genomes project. We've been fascinated by the progress that's been made there. And it's also played a lot into our thinking about how we invest in technologies generally, but also how we build upon the insights that we're getting into, particularly into cancer genomics and rare diseases, which are two areas which we're very heavily invested in. So, I mean, this is, I think, is very complementary to also to what Paul was saying. And you can see here that each of these, I guess, blocks of innovation interact and build upon each other. And it's not so many years ago, 5 to 10 years ago, when you were in a pharmaceuticals company, you'd sort of look at the state of the art in diagnostics, you'd look at the state of the art in terms of outcomes in a particular patient setting, and you'd take that as a given. You'd invest in a drug development program, and when that was finished, the market situation with diagnostics or with outcomes hadn't shifted that much. And it was, you didn't need to pay much attention to what were going on in these other technology spaces in order to be successful in your work. But this is changing very rapidly, and we're seeing that instead of having sort of 5-year steps of innovation, that these are getting much more accelerated, and this interdependency of these different blocks is accelerating, and they're becoming more and more integrated. And this to the extent that you can see almost a codependency between many of these blocks of technology and how they're driving innovation forward in the healthcare space. You know, in terms of, for instance, digital technologies and data processing, using technologies such as machine learning, the abilities that we're having to collect very large volumes of healthcare data, to store them at relatively cheap cost, the access to compute technologies which are allowing us to do things like machine learning and analyze much larger pieces of data and chunks of data than we were previously is also driving this forward. And there's an interplay between, as I say, between these technology blocks and the sciences, which I've got here on the chart in terms of behavioral science, the ability to drive personalised healthcare forward, and real-world data science. And again, there's an interdependency between these sciences and those technology blocks, and the barriers between them are shrinking, they're becoming better integrated, and this sort of circle of innovation is moving faster and faster. And just in terms of digital technology in the context of data collection, we're now looking at a much wider source of data than we have previously. So again, in the pharmaceutical industry, where we'd have focused much more on clinical trials data previously, we're now expanding our view of the data that can be used to drive decision-making by regulators, by health technology agencies, and by payers, and looking at a much broader set of potential data. And there's areas here where which are growing extremely fast. So patient-generated data or patient-derived data from either from apps or from specific tools is growing very rapidly. the ability to survey patients using ePRO, so electronic patient-reported outcomes is accelerating. And we're getting a much broader establishment of electronic health records, but we still see there's an awful lot of room for improvement in terms of standardization, uptake, capture of that interaction between the healthcare professional and the patient, and making these data sets interoperable. So there's still an awful lot of opportunity for us to do this. And obviously we've also been making much bigger use of the things which are on the left side of the chart there, and these have become more standardized and more interoperable. And, you know, coming back to the point that Paul made also about this interface or the translation between clinical research and clinical practice, and how this interface is getting smaller and smaller, and the translation is getting much more rapid, and we're seeing the ability to do clinical research in practice settings, again, is driving the need for access to routine clinical data and real-world data to help generate hypotheses, test hypotheses, and then develop evidence for decision-making. And at the base of all this is essentially this, this quite simple notion that what we want to do to drive clinical research forward and innovations is essentially having a good description of the patient, so genotype, characteristics of the patient, rapid phenotyping of the patient, an understanding of outcomes, and again this is enabled by digital tools, and then also overlaying this with innovations, so either innovations in terms of novel pharmaceuticals, novel diagnostics, or novel practices, and accelerating this loop of learning between having these interventions and then understanding how this impacts patient outcomes is being driven by this ecosystem and this access to much more rapid access to digital data, and particularly on the right side of this chart, so EHRs through to surveys and patient-derived data. And this has driven us at Roche to think much more broadly beyond, I guess, our sort of core technologies in terms of pharmaceuticals and diagnostics. And we've focused on this for many years now in terms of diagnostic and molecular data, clinical trials data, and, as I say, increasingly real-world data. But we've now, over the past few years, expanded this view of technologies and invested in Foundation Medicine, which is a clinical genomics profiling service, and Flatiron, which is a company which is focused on developing EHRs or electronic health records in the oncology space. And this with the goal of driving more efficient and effective research and development and improving access to and personalization of patient care. So this has become sort of core to our corporate strategy. And as we're also beginning to focus on diseases which have significant unmet need, we're moving to areas where we see there's a major unmet need which needs to be served, and we're focusing more and more as well on rare diseases. At the outset of each development program which we embark upon, we need to essentially review, as I say, this whole ecosystem of diagnostics, development, and care, and think very carefully through, for instance, what does the development toolbox look like in this disease? What's the conceptualization of the disease? What's the current standard of care, and what are the variations therein? What are the biomarkers and other stratification tools which we can use in development programs? What are the primary and secondary endpoints of methods of assessment? And then think about how we can use this panoply of technology to accelerate that, make this as efficient as possible, and also ensure that we're able to deliver that innovation in a clinical setting. So developing also disease management tools. And we apply these technologies to create more patient-centric, more efficient and more effective development programs. Now, I just want to talk through a couple of applications of this, or a couple of examples. And this example is in autism spectrum disorder. It's the basis for an IMI project called EU AIMS, which is actually in its second generation now. And when we initially began to look into this disease in around 2011, it's a very important disease in society. It has an incidence of about 1 in 68 births. It affects males about 4 times more frequently than females. We know there's a strong genetic link, so doing all the genomics work has been essential for us. But in terms of treatment, there's no treatment for the core systems. We've got 2 medicines which are used for irritability. But when you look at the symptoms of this disease and how this affects patient, you can see that there's first of all a very high unmet medical need, but that the core clinical features are poorly understood, variations in them are poorly understood, how they're associated with one another are poorly understood, and also how we can measure these and develop endpoints is poorly understood. So this has been the basis of the EU AIMS project, and we've been trying to dig into this and really focus in on those core clinical features, particularly the social communication deficits and the repetitive behaviours, and develop medicines which are going to alleviate these symptoms for patients and lead to better outcomes. So as I said, this was the state in 2011. No major strategy for this disease defined within Europe. No major or concerted efforts in drug discovery. No validated clinical endpoints. No regulatory strategy. Late diagnosis and poor awareness within the public. Poor knowledge of patients' needs across the life course of the disease, and a wide range of different strategies in treatment strategy, and relatively little evidence of efficacy in terms of addressing those core symptoms. And these sorts of undertakings, I think, are ideal for public-private partnerships, where it's important to engage clinical stakeholders, the patients themselves and patient groups, and, as I say, this has been the basis for the EU AIMS project. Another very short example I'd like to talk to you about briefly is novel endpoints in Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. Here in this disease, the existing primary regulatory endpoints are around about 100 years old, and this is, almost difficult to believe that such it's a life-impacting disease. We haven't made major progress in terms of the endpoints in the last 100 years. So the existing primary endpoints are a 6-minute walk test and a 4-stair climb, sort of quite crude measures of function. The existing endpoints have major weaknesses in terms of suboptimal sensitivity to functional change and subjectivity to observer and other errors and manipulation. And we've been involved now in the qualification of a novel secondary endpoint, which is called 95th percentile stride velocity, using a wearable device as an outcome measurement. And this allows patient function to be monitored at home, so it gives high ecological validity. And you can see now that there's a draft guidance as a secondary endpoint for regulatory decision making, which is being assessed by the European Medicines Agency. So this is, as I say, in terms of digital biomarkers and complementary devices and connected devices, this is very complementary to what Paul described to you in terms of the innovations in genomics, with potential in clinical development for objective, precise and continuous measurement of systems in home settings, with ecologically valid endpoints through remote measurement, control for symptom fluctuations on a within day or day to day, a potential to capture treatment effects very early, and a reduction of the assessment burden for patients. And beyond clinical development, identifying patients in need of treatment, developing real-world evidence for treatment effects, developing functional outcomes of measurement to support potentially outcomes-based reimbursement, and also moving beyond simply delivering a therapeutic, but tools which can improve patient management. So with that, I'll conclude, and thank you very much.